The boarding gate buzzed with last-minute announcements and distant footsteps of rushed passengers, but Mara stood completely still. Her small frame blocked the path between the boarding attendant and the open gate, and tears streaked silently down her cheeks. Her little fists were clenched at her sides, her backpack nearly slipping off one shoulder, but she wouldn't move. Not an inch. Not when they called her name. Not when they offered her snacks or a window seat. Not even when the last boarding call echoed through the terminal. She stood her ground, unmoving, like the world had frozen and she was the only one who still felt the storm. Her father, David, stood behind her, tall, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. Not from exhaustion, but something deeper. Something he couldn't explain, not even to himself. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, when everyone else had given up, he stepped forward, knelt beside her, and whispered, "Let's keep going." The words weren't loud, but they cracked something open. Not in Mara, but in him. And maybe that's why she finally turned to look at him, because the voice wasn't the one that scolded her, hurried her, or told her to be strong. It was different. Softer. Fragile. Like he wasn't speaking to her, but to a memory she held. The memory of a father she hadn't seen in months, even while he was sitting right next to her. Everyone at the gate watched. The silence was heavier than any announcement. David took her backpack and slowly reached for her hand, and when she didn't pull away, he knew they were already on a new path. The plane took off without them. And as the wheels left the ground, so did the weight in his chest. But this wasn't how it began. Not even close. It started long before the airport. Before the tears. Before she refused to move. It began in a gas station parking lot, 2 states away, where Mara had refused to eat. David had been driving for hours. The road stretched endlessly, and the sky was a flat, faded blue. He had hoped the motion would lull her into sleep, or at least silence. But kids weren't like that, especially not Mara. Not since her mom left. She had barely spoken a word since the funeral. They had stopped at a worn-out diner near the interstate. David ordered pancakes. Mara just looked at the menu, then out the window. When the food came, she didn't touch it. Instead, she whispered, "Do pancakes taste different without a mom?" David didn't answer. He couldn't. His fork froze mid-air. Something about her question pierced through the numbness he had wrapped around himself. He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying, but from holding it all in. He paid the bill in silence, packed the food into a box, and they left. Back on the road, Mara curled up by the window. Her reflection stared back at her, superimposed on endless fields of nothing. David wanted to say something, anything. But his voice was stuck behind the walls he had built. Not out of cruelty, but survival. His wife, the love of his life, had died so suddenly that even now, months later, it still felt like a bad dream. Mara didn't understand why they had to leave home. Why they were driving across the country instead of staying in their little yellow house where every corner smelled like her mother. But David couldn't stay there. Not another minute. Everything reminded him of her. The closet. The coffee mug on the counter. The pillow with strands of her hair still woven in. So he took the only thing he had left that felt alive. Mara. And they drove. The days passed in motel rooms and fast food bags. David became an expert at pretending to be okay. He'd smile at gas station clerks, thank waitresses, even joke with strangers. But Mara knew. She always knew. Because kids don't listen to words. They listen to silence. And David was full of it. One evening, they found themselves in a small town where the main street still had fairy lights from a forgotten holiday. They stayed in a bed and breakfast run by an older woman named June. She smelled like cinnamon and spoke in questions that didn't need answers. That night, as David tried to sleep on a creaky mattress, he heard Mara talking to someone. He tiptoed to the door and listened. Mara was in the kitchen with June, sipping warm milk. "Is my dad broken?" Mara asked. June didn't laugh. She didn't correct her. She just said, "Some things break so quietly, we don't even hear them. But that doesn't mean they can't be mended." David didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling and wondered how his daughter had become wiser than him. The next morning, they set out again. The map on the dashboard was wrinkled, marked with ink. But David no longer had a destination. He told himself he was looking for jobs, for schools, for a new start. But deep down, he was just running. From grief. From guilt. From the version of himself that had let go of Mara's hand at the funeral when she needed it most. And then came the letter. Folded and tucked into Mara's backpack, between her coloring book and a half-eaten granola bar. David found it one morning when she was in the shower. The handwriting was childish but clear. "Dear Mom. Dad doesn't smile anymore. I think he forgot how. I tried making jokes like you did, but he just stares at the road. Sometimes, I pretend we're going to find you. Like maybe you got lost. But I know you didn't. I miss you so much. I miss the way your hair smelled and the way you laughed even when your cake flopped. If you can see us, please help Dad. He's not mean, just really, really sad. Love. Mara." David read it once. Then again. And then he broke. Not loudly. Not with screaming or fists. Just quietly, like a glass cracking from the inside. That was 3 days before the airport. 3 days before Mara refused to leave. 3 days before David finally whispered, "Let's keep going." Because for the first time since the funeral, he realized that they weren't running from something. They were searching for something. And maybe, just maybe, they had just found the beginning of it. 6 days earlier, the road had stretched out in silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be broken. It was the kind that wrapped around your chest like a weight, heavy, steady, and impossible to escape. The kind that only grows between two people sitting inches apart but drifting miles away in thought. The kind of silence a man holds when he's terrified of saying the wrong thing to the one person left who might still need him. Mara stared out the window of the rental car, her reflection barely visible in the smudged glass. Her earbuds were in, but no music played. It was just a shield. A barrier. Something to keep her father's voice out. Not that he was trying to speak. He hadn't said more than 20 words since they left the cemetery. She had asked him one thing, just one. "Can we go somewhere else before we go home?" His nod was barely noticeable, but it was all she needed. She didn't know where somewhere else was. Neither did he. But he turned left instead of right. Out of the city. Away from the house full of empty shoes and unopened mail. Away from the kitchen that still smelled like her. Away from the bedroom that hadn't been touched since hospice brought in that hospital bed. They drove with no GPS. No destination. Just a map folded open between them like some kind of truce neither of them dared speak aloud. He took the back roads, as if speed would betray the gravity of grief. Every now and then Mara would glance over at the man who used to be steel. Who used to command rooms with a raised eyebrow. Who used to call her Peanut and toss her in the air until she screamed with laughter. Now he just gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him upright. In a small town off Route 27, they stopped for gas. Mara wandered into the tiny convenience store. The cashier barely looked up. It smelled like burnt coffee and mothballs, and the radio played a static-filled version of some country song about missing someone who ain't coming home. She stood there, holding a bottle of orange soda, when a woman's voice behind her said, "That one used to be my daughter's favorite." Mara didn't turn around. She didn't want to talk. But the woman continued, "I lost her 3 years ago. Cancer. She was 20. Mara finally turned. The woman wasn't old, 40, maybe, but her eyes were hollow in the way that told Mara she wasn't lying. "I'm sorry," Mara whispered. The woman smiled. "We just keep going. Not because we're strong. Because there's no other choice." The words dug under Mara's skin like thorns. She left the soda on the counter and walked out. Back in the car, she didn't tell her dad what the woman said. But something shifted. That night, they found a roadside motel. The kind with doors that open straight to the parking lot and beds that squeak even if you breathe too hard. Mara lay in the dark, eyes wide open, counting the cracks in the ceiling. "I thought I'd feel something," she whispered. When she died. Her father, lying 2 feet away on the other bed, didn't answer. She waited. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he didn't know what to say. But then she heard it, the soft rustle of sheets, the inhale of someone bracing for pain. "I feel nothing," he said finally. "And everything." Mara rolled to her side, staring at the silhouette of her father's back. "You loved her differently than I did," she said. "You knew her before. Before the cancer." He was silent again. "Then, and you knew her after." "When I couldn't." The confession cracked the air like thunder in a quiet room. Mara didn't know what to say to that. So she said nothing. The next morning, they kept driving. No plan. Just movement. In a diner outside Ashland, Kentucky, a waitress with a half-sleeve of tattoos asked Mara if she wanted whipped cream on her waffles. Mara looked up, surprised by the question, as if kindness was something she'd forgotten how to receive. "Yes," she said, almost unsure. The whipped cream came out in a mountain, crowned with a cherry. Her dad didn't order anything. Just sipped coffee. Black. No sugar. No cream. The same way he always had it. Mara watched him stir it anyway. Stirring nothing. Just turning the spoon in slow, mindless circles. He caught her looking and set the spoon down. "You know," he said, clearing his throat, "your mom used to put whipped cream on everything. Even pancakes." Mara smiled, barely. "Yeah." She called it breakfast joy. It was the first time they said her name without it tasting like blood in their mouths. By the third day, they weren't so afraid of silence. It had changed shape. Not an enemy now. Just a companion. On the side of the highway in Tennessee, they pulled over to watch a storm roll in. Mara stood in the grass, arms outstretched, letting the rain soak her hoodie. Her father stayed in the car at first, then stepped out, standing beside her. The sky cracked open with thunder. Mara didn't flinch. "I dream about her," she said suddenly. But she never says anything. She just smiles. Like she's waiting for me to say something first. Her father didn't reply. Just watched the same sky, the same gray. She used to say the hardest part of dying wasn't the pain, Mara added. It was worrying that we wouldn't be okay. Her voice cracked. And we're not. We're not okay. He turned to her, rain dripping from his hair, soaking through his dress shirt. "But we're trying," he said. "And maybe that's enough." Mara looked at him. Really looked. And for a second, she wasn't angry. Just tired. Tired of holding on to the grief like it was the only proof her mother had ever existed. She nodded. A small, broken gesture. But it was something. That night, they didn't get a motel. They parked at a rest stop and slept in the car. Curled up, knees to chest. Mara opened the glove compartment and pulled out the old Polaroid her mom used to keep there. Mara, 6 years old, standing in front of a Ferris wheel, her face painted like a tiger. Her mom behind her, mid-laugh. Wind in her hair. Mara stared at it a long time. Then whispered, "I miss your laugh, Mom." Her father reached over, placing his hand gently on hers. So do I. By the fourth day, something in the air felt different. Not lighter, but not as suffocating. They passed a lake and Mara asked to stop. She walked to the edge, pulled off her sneakers, and waded into the water. It was freezing. It bit at her skin and made her gasp. But she kept walking. Her father called out, alarmed. She turned back, waist deep now. I just want to feel something, she shouted over the wind. He didn't answer. Just kicked off his shoes and walked in after her. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. Just stood beside her, chest heaving, both of them shaking. They stood there for minutes, hours, lifetimes. Letting the cold burn away what the fire of grief could not. They didn't mean to end up in the town where her mother grew up. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't even spoken aloud between them. But somewhere between fatigue and the quiet ache of curiosity, Mara had whispered, what was the name of that town, where she spent her summers as a girl? Her dad hadn't answered right away. He just stared ahead for a long moment, then quietly said, Bridgetown. That was enough. They changed course, like a river cutting through rock, carving a path they hadn't planned to walk. Bridgetown was the kind of place that didn't fight time, it let time settle on its shoulders like a coat. The buildings leaned a little. The paint peeled without apology. And the wind carried stories from porches and gravel roads. Mara rolled down her window as they entered Main Street. This place smells like, she began, then trailed off. Sun on old wood, her father said. And peach cobbler. Mara gave a soft smile. She always said her grandma made the best cobbler in the world. She was right, he said, his voice wrapped in something both sharp and tender. She used to steal a second piece, hide it in a napkin, and sneak it back to me after dinner. The memory hung in the air like music only they could hear. They parked outside a weathered house with a white porch swing and vines that climbed lazily over the railing. No one had lived there in years, but it was still standing, like a memory refusing to fade. Mara stepped out of the car first, walking toward the porch slowly, reverently. She ran her fingers along the wooden post, as if touching the past might make it speak. Her father stayed back, hands in his pockets. She used to read me stories here, Mara said. She told me this swing could fly if we closed our eyes hard enough. He nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. I believed her, Mara whispered. Me too, he replied. Inside, the house was locked, but they didn't try to enter. Some places aren't meant to be walked through again. Some places are sacred simply because they remain closed. They sat on the porch instead, letting the swing creak beneath them, as the sun lowered into a warm, golden hush. Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. It was the first time she had done that since the hospital. Later that night, at a small diner in town, they sat in a booth that her mother had once claimed was the best seat in the house. Mara ordered the cherry pie her mom used to love, and when it came, her father stared at it like it was an old friend who had returned from the war. She always said cherries were a rebellious fruit, he murmured. Sweet, but only after they've survived the sour. Mara picked up her fork but didn't eat. She just looked at him. Did you know she was going to die? She asked. The question was sharp. Direct. Honest. He didn't flinch. Yes, he said softly. But I didn't believe it. Not really. Not until that last morning. Mara looked down. Her voice was barely a breath. I thought you were angry at me. I was, he admitted. But not because you were with her. I was angry because you weren't angry at her. Because you kept smiling. Because you kept being brave. His voice broke. And I couldn't. I wasn't brave. Mara shook her head. You were there. Every day. Every night. I was a shell, he said. I stayed because leaving felt worse, but I wasn't. I wasn't present. Not like you were. Mara's eyes burned. I stayed because I thought, if I was there enough, if I kept talking, maybe she wouldn't go. They both sat in silence for a long time, letting the pie grow cold. Then, without a word, he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was small, soft, real, and it was enough. The next morning, they visited the town library. Mara remembered her mother saying she used to spend hours there reading every book she could get her hands on. She wanted to be a writer once, Mara said, running her fingers over the spines of old books. Did she ever tell you that? She wrote me a story, he said. When we were dating. About a tree that didn't grow leaves until it heard music. That sounds like her, Mara said, smiling through the tears. She said words could fix things. Her dad nodded. They do. Eventually. They spent the rest of the day walking through the town like tourists of someone else's memories. But every corner held a whisper of her. A mural on a brick wall, a girl in a red dress that looked just like the one she wore to their wedding. A bakery with cinnamon rolls that smelled like her Sunday mornings. A bench by the lake with a carving that read, R+E 1996. Mara traced the letters with her finger. That's you, she said. And Mom. It is, he replied, his voice trembling. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water, they sat on the bench together. Mara looked at him. Really looked. You know, she said, for a long time I thought you stopped loving her. He turned to her slowly. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to love someone who was leaving. Mara's breath caught. She never stopped loving you either. He blinked, once, twice. Then laughed softly. You sound like her. That's because she taught me everything I know, Mara said, leaning her head back against the bench. For the first time in months, they both laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt good to let the grief bend without breaking them. That night, they didn't drive anywhere. They stayed at a small inn by the lake. Mara fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the memory of her mother's lullaby. Her father stayed awake a little longer, staring out the window, whispering things he never got to say. The morning fog draped the lake like a secret. Mara sat at the edge of the pier, her feet dangling just above the water. The wooden planks beneath her creaked gently with every movement, and the air smelled of pine and the quiet kind of peace that only arrives after a storm. She didn't hear her father approach, but she knew it was him by the sound of his steps, steady, deliberate, as if each one was a silent apology finally spoken. He sat beside her without saying a word. For a while, they both just watched the water. Then she whispered, "Do you remember what she said the night before she left us?" Her voice didn't break this time. It held steady like the lake. He nodded slowly. She said, "Promise me you two will keep going, even if it feels impossible." Mara glanced sideways at him. "Do you think we did that? Kept going?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the morning sun was finally beginning to push through the fog. "I think we tried," he said. "But we didn't try together. Not until now." She nodded. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was shared. Sacred. Later that day, they packed up the car again. No destination this time. Just a direction. West. Toward whatever came next. The radio played softly in the background, some forgotten tune her mother used to hum while folding laundry. Mara rested her head against the window, eyes half closed. "You think she'd be proud of us?" He didn't take his eyes off the road, but his smile was soft. "I think she already was. Long before we knew how to be proud of ourselves." At a gas station outside of a town too small to have a name, they met an old man selling handmade wind chimes from the back of his truck. Mara wandered over, drawn by the soft clinking of glass and metal in the breeze. One caught her eye, a small one, with pieces shaped like tiny birds and stars. She would have loved this, she said, running her fingers gently along the edge. Her dad paid for it without a word, then tied it to the rearview mirror. As they pulled away, the chimes sang quietly. A song made of fragments and air. Like a memory that refused to disappear. They made stops when they felt like it. A bookstore in a sleepy town with dusty shelves and a black cat sleeping near the register. A field of sunflowers where they got lost chasing shadows. A coastal cliff where Mara screamed into the wind just to see if it would answer. And one night, parked under a sky so star-filled it looked fake, she turned to him and asked, "When did you stop being afraid to talk about her?" He looked up at the stars, then back at her. "When I realized forgetting doesn't protect you from pain. It just makes the pain lonelier." Mara nodded. "I was never angry that you cried," she said. "I was angry that you cried in silence." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the glove box and pulled out a notebook. Old. Worn. Her mother's. "She used to write things down," he said. "Not stories. Just moments. Little things she didn't want to forget." He handed it to Mara. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. There were entries about Mara's first lost tooth. The smell of the kitchen after rain. A fight they once had over something neither of them remembered. And then, one line written in faded blue ink. "If I go, tell Mara to keep walking. Tell her I love the way she looks at the world, even when the world doesn't look back." Mara closed the notebook and held it to her chest. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry. Not this time. In the final town they visited, they didn't mean to stay. But something about it felt like a pause button. Like a breath before a new sentence. It had a library, a park, a bakery, and a tiny apartment above a flower shop that was, miraculously, available for rent. "It's temporary," Mara had said. "Just until I figure out what's next." Her dad didn't argue. He just carried her suitcase up the stairs. They painted the walls together. Chose silly colors. Laughed when the blue ended up more like seafoam. They argued over curtain styles, furniture placement, and who got the bigger closet. But they did it all with a gentleness that hadn't existed between them before. One day, while organizing books, Mara found a photo of her mother tucked into the back of a novel. She placed it on the windowsill, where the light would hit it just right each morning. And that night, over takeout and candlelight, she whispered, "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" her father asked. "To stop being angry at life for not turning out the way I thought it would." He smiled. "That's a big step." She nodded. "But I don't want to take it alone." "You won't," he said. And he didn't. From then on, every morning began with coffee and soft conversation. Every week, they wrote down something new they had learned, about each other, about her mother, about themselves. And every month, they added a pin to the map on the wall. A new place. A new chapter. A new reason to keep going. One evening, as the wind picked up and the sky painted itself in shades of lavender and gold, Mara stood at the edge of the local airport's viewing platform. It wasn't the one they had started from, but it looked just like it. She watched a plane taxi across the tarmac, its lights blinking like Morse code from the past. Her father stood beside her. "Do you miss her?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "But it doesn't hurt the same way anymore." "No," he said. "Now it reminds me she was real." They stood there a while longer, until the plane disappeared into the clouds. Then, just as they turned to leave, he touched her arm. "Let's keep going," he said. And this time, she didn't hesitate. She smiled, took his hand, and whispered, "Yes. Let's."